Welcome to the Anxiety Attic, where I make self-help videos for anxiety disorders. Today's video is a difficult subject. I'm going to talk about the relationship between anxiety and grief. Loss is something that we all have to face eventually, and that fact really hit home in recent months when my dear mother-in-law Doreen sadly passed away, and soon afterwards Andrew, my friend of 40 years, also passed away. I felt extremely sad in both cases and wept for them both. But the sadness I felt is nothing compared to the grief that those closest to them will feel. Everyone experiences and processes grief in different ways, but feelings of sadness, anger, loneliness, helplessness, numbness, guilt and anxiety are all common in people who are grieving. Grief can also manifest itself in physical symptoms, like a hollow feeling in the stomach, a tight chest, a lump in the throat, depersonalization, fatigue or a dry mouth. The loss of a loved one can lead to thoughts about your own mortality. And with all these physical symptoms, it's not surprising that those grieving may start showing signs of health anxiety. But the stress and uncertainty that the loss of a loved one brings could also cause panic attacks, separation anxiety, generalized anxiety, and in cases where the death has been in traumatic circumstances, even PTSD. Numerous studies have shown that the prevalence of anxiety disorders is significantly higher in the bereaved than in the general population. For people who already have anxiety disorders, the loss of a loved one can be even more difficult. Adjusting to a world without your loved one is one of the difficult steps of the grieving process that everyone has to go through. But people with a prior anxiety disorder may have been very dependent on the person they have lost, having allowed them to make decisions for them or do the tasks that they fear. With the support gone, they may worry about how they will cope on their own. It's important to recognise that anxiety is quite normal following a bereavement and will not necessarily develop into an anxiety disorder. Some people may have one or more panic attacks around the time of the loss, but may not go on to develop a panic disorder. But if anxiety symptoms and behaviours persist and continue to get worse for a long time after the bereavement, then you really should seek help. Grief counselling can be very helpful even if you haven't developed an anxiety disorder or complicated grief, which I will talk more about in a moment. A grief counsellor can help you understand what is just a normal part of the grieving process and what is cause for concern and could be addressed in the counselling sessions. For example, some people may experience hallucinations and see their lost loved one shortly after the bereavement. This may make them fear that they're going mad, and grief counsellors can reassure them that this is actually quite common and not a sign of psychosis. Grief counsellors can also spot signs of complicated grief, which has recently been renamed Persistent Complex Bereavement Disorder in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. However, I think most therapists will probably still refer to it as complicated grief. One or more of the following indicators being present for over 1 year in adults can suggest complicated grief. A persistent yearning or longing for the deceased. Intense sorrow and emotional pain in response to the death. A preoccupation with the deceased, or a preoccupation with the circumstances of the death. However, for a diagnosis to be made, these must be accompanied by at least 6 of the following symptoms. I will not read them all out, but you can pause the video if you want to take a closer look. Surprisingly, anxiety is not mentioned, but studies have shown that people with complicated grief are at a higher risk of developing an anxiety disorder, and people who already have an anxiety disorder are at a higher risk of developing complicated grief. Therefore, any therapy should address both the anxiety disorder and the complicated grief, as treating just the anxiety disorder may not be effective. Therapy for complicated grief involves finding which stage of the grief process you are struggling with, exploring the reasons why, and then helping you find ways to complete the process. There is much literature on the stages of the grieving process, but grieving is not a sequential, orderly process, which is why I like the terminology of grieving task used by William Warden in his book Grief Counselling and Grief Therapy. Warden identifies the following tasks: accepting the reality of the loss, processing the pain, adjusting to the world without the loved one, and finding an enduring connection with a loved one while embarking on a new life. Being stuck with one or more of these tasks may be linked to or cause an anxiety disorder, so it's important to get help. The good news is that most grief counsellors are also trained in anxiety disorders, or if they aren't, they can refer you to someone who is trained in both areas. There are many charities who can help you get access to free or low-cost grief counselling, like Cruise in the UK or Hope for Bereaved in America. I'll put links in the description. So, if you are struggling with grief, reach out to a grief counsellor. Talking to someone about your grief can really help. Take care of yourselves.